Hello and welcome to the 152nd episode of From Alpha to Omega. Today is Friday the 26th of February 2021 and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. This week I'm delighted to welcome Chris Knight to the show to perform a friendly critique of the anthropological work of David Graeber, who recently passed away suddenly. Chris is a Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Anthropology in University College London and the author of several books. This week I have the new patrons William Smith and Sean Phipps to thank. If you'd like to help keep the lights on and the episodes flowing, why not head on over to Patreon, where for $5 a month, where you can find a heap of bonus episodes and live streams and get access to the Emancipation Network Discord server, where there's some damn lively discussion on everything from theory to comedy gossip. Okay, let's join the interview. It really kind of made me understand a bit more where he would position himself close to like MMT and post-Keynesians as opposed to Marxists. You know, he always would hang around with, Steve Keen types and people like that, which I was always quite confused about his politics.
Well, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, and I derive my politics from my understanding that we became human in a revolution, that becoming human was a revolutionary process, as well as an evolutionary one. And I didn't commit myself to the revolution until I kind of understood what the revolution meant. So although I was hanging around my Trotskyists and other revolutionary friends at college back in the 60s, I was quite reluctant to sort of commit to the revolutionary program out of the usual concerns about what happens to revolutions, especially the Russian Revolution with Stalin and stuff. So when I finally found I could commit to the revolution, it was because I'd sort of worked out, at least to my own satisfaction, that this was the human revolution. This was not sort of an event in one state or country or some tinkering around with legislation or something. This was a repeat of the revolution through which we became human and learned to speak to one another and share our dreams and all that stuff. So I'm just saying that all of us, when we have a theory or a commitment, it's sort of an intellectual commitment, mostly it connects up with our political commitment. Yeah, I'm just saying, I can only speak confidently, really, about the anthropology of Graeber and where it leads to politically. What I'm saying is, I suppose, I never independently followed his political trajectory. I wasn't too interested in that. I was mostly interested in his anthropology.
So, Chris, when you say the human revolution with respect to anthropology, what are you getting at?
Well, it's a term within mainstream archaeology, which is that we humans are a species of hominin, quite closely related to chimpanzees and bonobos. But during the course of our evolution, something very strange began to happen. Our brain size started to expand sort of more, almost exponentially from beginning about 2 million years ago, but really, really accelerating a huge amount from about 500,000 years ago. And things started to happen which were so odd in terms of what normally happens with biological evolution, so rapid and so spectacular. And things began to happen like the emergence of art and ritual and, of course, language, which is right off the chart. I mean, as a system of communication, nothing like words and grammar exists anywhere else in nature, as Noam Chomsky will tell you. Something quite remarkable began to happen, and it's logical to call that a revolution. I mean, humans are a species born in a kind of revolution. I mean, there are lots of arguments about whether it was just a kind of cognitive revolution or a technological revolution or a social or political revolution. But my own view, and it's my area of, my specialist area, is that it was all of those. It was a revolution in every sense, and it established something quite unusual for an ape. Most chimpanzees are extremely despotic in their social arrangements. You get alpha males extremely violent towards females. Females, get harassed and raped, including, by their brothers. where female chimpanzees on reaching maturity, they mostly need to get out of the way and move somewhere else where they don't have any relatives, because otherwise their male relatives will be real pain. Whereas early humans, if extant hunters and gatherers are anything to go by, were essentially communistic and egalitarian, and that's an astonishing thing to say. I mean, there's nothing communist about chimpanzees in the wild, and yet early humans seem to have been very much egalitarian, including gender egalitarian, from everything we know about extant hunter-gatherers, especially in Africa, where you don't practice storage. So becoming human involved turning the world upside down, overthrowing the logic of dominance and competition, which is a feature of most monkey and ape social life.
How does that interact with, say, the development of the bonobo?
Well, that's a very good question, because the bonobo example makes it very clear that the dominance of chimpanzees has nothing to do with their genetics, really. So it's perfectly possible to have chimpanzees who, in this particular case, that what happened was that about 1 million years ago, chimpanzees, probably much like today's chimpanzees, during a period of dry, managed to cross the Congo River to the south and found an absolute paradise in terms of enormous, lush, rich semi-aquatic resources. And that meant that the females could travel together, foraging together. They didn't have to disperse because there's plenty of food around. And that meant that the females could, in the course of bonding with each other and forming alliances, they could beat up any male that interfered with them or try to snatch their food the way common chimps would. So bonobos are essentially matriarchal. And if anything, it's even more surprising. With bonobos, it's almost the infants who rule the roost. And that's because no big male wants to get on the wrong side of an infant, because mum will be watching, and then a whole bunch of females will jump on him. So the males are dominant. The males can't be dominant at all. And if anything, it's the young who, if there is any section of society which is dominant, it's the young. Now, that's not what humans did. We didn't move in quite that way, but we did have a sort of matriarchy. So which my colleague Morna Finnegan terms communism in motion, which means that you have a ritual structure with all religions. If you go back far enough, you'll find they're linked to the moon, essentially. That's maybe the sun as well, but mostly the moon. I mean, what we know from hunter-gatherers today in Africa, particularly the people that Morna studies, the Benjeli Congo forest people, the females will bond together in a very raucous, sexy, assertive invasion of the camp space and establish a temporary kind of rule of women. And having made their point for a few days and taunted the men and made kind of rude remarks about their sexual anatomy and all kinds of adult humor at male expense, the women will now feel, okay, we made our point, and let them, kind of thing. It's getting a bit boring now running this, the camp. Let's give the men a chance. But that's only because once you've let the sort of male counter-revolution happen for a period, it gives you the joy of overthrowing the system once again. And they sort of have a roughly monthly insurrection against male power, but it's all playful and it's all based on laughter as a leavening device. And so whereas the bonobos are permanently matriarchal, it looks as if our hominin ancestors had a kind of the best of all worlds, having a bit of matriarchy, a bit of patriarchy, what Morna calls a pendulum of power between the two genders. And that still goes on today.
Okay, so this seems like quite an abstract start for us here, talking about the politics or the anthropology of David Graeber. So, like, I consider this a friendly critique as somebody who has read a bit of David Graeber, but I absolutely would not consider myself in any sense a expert or even, an amateur in anthropology. So how do you juxtapose then this kind of idea of where humans came from with, say, the work of David Graeber?
Well, this is David's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which of course made him a celebrity. And he has been called the Elvis of anthropology, in the sense that he managed to make anthropology sexy and became a celebrity in the process. And and so here is David in a passage in the book Debt, several pages on communism. And he says, I will define communism as any human relationship that operates on the principle of from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. And so he's saying really that communism is all over the place, because in any family, in any face-to-face interaction with anyone with their friends, you might be a plumber with your mate, and you might say, hand me the wrench, and you don't expect the mate to sort of say, well, what's in it for me? Your mates, you're cooperating, and you just you meet people's needs insofar as you have the ability, and he calls that communism. And he says communism's everywhere, but he also says don't imagine it's possible to have a communist society, because the state is everywhere as well. So he says that just as communism is everywhere and comes naturally to all of us, we just feel instinctively we're kind of communist. If somebody asks you for a cigarette or for directions or something, you'll just think, well, you gain some pleasure in helping, because then you feel you're useful, and you might, as Karl Marx said, if you're human and social, you will gain enjoyment from providing enjoyment for others, as we do, of course, in sex and so many other things. But he says, and I'm going to quote here, our thinking about communism has been dominated by a myth. Okay, and by the myth he means the theory, which, by the way, I have, that we were once communists. That, in other words, that it's called primitive communism, of course. And he says, our thinking about communism has been dominated by a myth. Once upon a time, and here David begins to sort of take the piss out of people like me. Once upon a time, humans held all things in common. In the Garden of Eden, during the golden age of Saturn, in Paleolithic hunter-gatherer bands. Then came the fall, as a result of which we are now cursed with divisions of power and private property. The dream was that someday, with the advance of technology and general prosperity, with social revolution, or with the guidance of the party, spelled with a capital P, we would finally be in a position to put things back, to restore common ownership and common management of collective resources. Throughout the last 2 centuries, communists and anti-communists argued over how plausible this picture was and whether it would be a blessing or a nightmare, but they all agreed on the basic framework. Communism was about collective property. Primitive communism did once exist. We might call this mythic communism or even epic communism, a story we like to tell ourselves. Since the days of the French Revolution, it has inspired millions, but it has also done enormous damage to humanity. It's high time, I think, to brush the entire argument aside. So David is saying communism, and you can sort of see a positive component of this. He says, don't relegate communism to a mythic past or to a mythic utopian future. Communism is all over the place. It always was and it always will be. Capitalism depends on communism. If we all just asked, if we all said, what's in it for me every time any interaction happened, capitalism wouldn't be able to pay for all those things we do spontaneously in caring for each other, for our neighbors, for our family, for our mates, and getting on with each other. So he says, capitalism is parasitic on the prior existence of communism. But along with that, he says that don't even dream about a communist society, because any real social system would be pluralist. There'll be elements of capitalism, elements of competition, elements of the state. He points out, for example, that all languages, they have the imperative form, which means the form where you instruct somebody to do something. Give me this, give me that, do this, do that. Imperative. He says, well, what is the state except some people telling others what to do? And he says, well, in any society, there'll be times when you need to tell somebody what to do, like your mum saying to them, kids sort of, go and get the milk, that's on the doorstep, whatever, And so he says, communism is everywhere and always will be and always was. Competition and conflict is everywhere and always was and always will be. And the state, the sort of principle behind the state, the principle of telling people to do and then punishing them if they don't do. And he said that's all the state is. It's just one bunch of people telling others what to do. And if they don't do it, you punish them. So he's sort of saying that let's not worry about revolution. Let's not try to have a social system based on any one principle. Let's just try to find more enclaves of communism within a system which is bound to be imperfect. So there will always be the state, but it might be a weak state. And if it's a weak state, a ramshackle state, a state which is all falling to bits, as by the way, he found when he went and did his fieldwork in Madagascar, so much the better. We can then kind of establish sort of elements of communism, elements of liberation within an imperfect overall social system. So give up the whole program of revolution. It's unrealistic.
So it's quite a theory to say, because there was the imperative in language, in all languages, that therefore there has always been the existence of a state or an equivalent in all times. You would think that it is both a gross oversimplification of what the state is, and also, I would like to hear your critique of the anthropology that would back up such a understanding of state in early human societies.
Well, yes, I mean, this is his book on kings, written with Marshall Salins, and it's on page 456. All human languages we know of have imperative forms, and in any society, there will be situations where it's considered appropriate for some individuals to tell others what to do. And then he goes on to say, you can't really talk about the origins of the state because it's always been there. So he says that one could probably make a case that in any complex human society, there are likely to be some circumstances in which some people can issue arbitrary commands. And then he goes on to sort of say that the idea that you could, he says, he sometimes uses the words the state and its principle, and he sometimes uses the word sovereignty and its principle. And he says that because kings have sovereignty, but maybe, I don't know, some other thing like parliament has sovereignty, but it's still the state. And he says, as I have said, the principle of sovereignty is still with us. Once it becomes the organizing principle of social life anywhere, it tends to prove extraordinarily difficult to uproot. Few at this point seem to be able to imagine what it would mean to uproot it. And so we have this paradox of an anarchist who accepts the inevitability of the state and casts doubt on the very idea that we could possibly uproot it. So just to respond to your question, among the Benjeli, the people that I know a little bit about the Hadza hunters and gatherers in Tanzania, having stayed with them for a bit, but many of my friends have done long-term fieldwork in Africa, and in particular, long-term fieldwork with a group of forest hunters and gatherers called the Benjeli, or the Bayaka. So, and they're traditionally been called pygmies with a capital P. They're slightly smaller stature than other people, simply because if you live in the forest, you don't want to have to keep stooping to avoid hitting a branch. So they're a little bit smaller than some people, like Ethiopians, for example, are a lot taller. Anyway, these people, the Benjeli, they are, I mean, just inspiringly, wonderfully egalitarian. Anyone that's lived with them just wants to stay there because there's a huge amount of laughter and fun and very little work going on because it's just an absolute economy of superabundance, really, with the animals you hunt and the honey and all the fruit and stuff. And laughter is the main leveling device. So any man, it's often a man who tries to sort of get above himself, throw his weight around. What will happen is that it's called Mwajo. A bunch of older ladies will start to imitate this guy's foolishness, and soon they're all laughing. And before long, all the younger women are beginning to laugh and laugh and laugh. And then they do this pantomime ridicule of the behaviour and idiosyncrasies of this particular guy until the whole camp is laughing, and they carry on laughing mercilessly. And what happens is there's only one person in the camp who's not laughing. Sort of guess who? It's the butt of all these jokes. And the women just will continue to laugh until finally he joins the human race and sees the idiocy of his own behavior, sees himself as others see him. And that's called reflexivity or egocentric perspective reversal. And when he laughs at his own former self, everyone thinks, okay, now you've got it. You've seen what an idiot you've been. So this form of leveling laughter is what maintains the gender egalitarianism of the society. But the other thing to say, again, in response to your question, is that nobody would dream of telling anybody else what to do. It just does not happen. Nobody tells somebody what to do. A mother wouldn't tell her children what to do. Advice is given through play, through encouragement, but the idea that some people have got the right of command over others isn't present. And although the language they speak had probably got the imperative, because it's actually it's not an indigenous hunter-gatherer language. Graeber's idea that the imperative is that the linguistic imperative somehow means that you're going to get dominance and submission, and some people with a right to tell others what to do. It's just wrong. But I should put that in a wider framework. The thing about David is that he categorically refused to even refer to hunter-gatherer ethnography. So anybody who'd spent their lives studying hunter-gatherers, it's a bit odd. The only way I can explain it is to go to some length, discussing his own fieldwork. But he dismissed completely. Although we were great friends and we got on fine, we often met in various actions, any kind of picket line, any kind of occupation of a bridge for Extinction Rebellion or whatever it was, or any massive, huge uprisings kind of in central London during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. When David and I were sort of on the same action, we would always gravitate towards each other and have a good chat. But the one thing we avoided was anthropology, because I now know, since he died, that he just told his friends, Chris makes everything up. He just makes it up as he goes along. And he didn't just dismiss. I mean, my work, you'll find in Graeber, just does not appear, does not exist. But not just my work. Even though I'm quite a well-known specialist in human origins research, but not just mine, but all the other anthropologists who've made hunting and gathering their sort of specialism. I mean, for example, Richard Lee, he's written at great length on primitive communism among the Kalahari Bushmen. His work doesn't figure for David, but Alan Barnard and James Woodburn. I mean, I won't mention names that won't mean much to your listeners, but these are the giants of hunter-gatherer research, and they just don't exist for David. He just it's not conscious censorship, but it's just written. We're all written out of history. When he says that there's no such thing as primitive communism, he says that on the basis of cutting out the evidence for primitive communism. If you want to call it primitive communism, I prefer Morna Finnegan's term, communism in motion. That captures it much better, because the word primitive isn't too good. But even the idea that you have a stable thing called communism isn't too realistic, because actually these hunter-gatherers, they enjoy establishing a kind of matriarchal egalitarianism, but they also enjoy letting it all collapse so that they can re-establish it, so that anybody that starts getting above themselves can be pulled down again in a rhythm. So the communism or the revolution is endlessly repeated and lost in a rhythmic way. So that's what Morna means by communism in motion. You don't just sit back and think, oh, we've got communism. You need to constantly lose it in order to regain it.
Yeah, so I think it's in that book on kings where he describes the, say, more basic, say, structured societies as living in fear of a god, that the god acts like a state. I was wondering if you could talk about that with respect to these societies and hunter-gatherer societies.
Thank you for asking that question. I mean, when I read in this book, Kings, that you can't have an egalitarian society because even with hunters and gatherers, they've got kings, I just thought, what are you talking about, David? I mean, really? Because he says that. I mean, so all hunters and gatherers have notions of potencies. For example, the game animals may very often have a guardian of the game animals. You've got to be quite careful when you go hunting that you respect the blood of the animals you're hunting, because the guardian of the game animals may punish you if you're abusive. It could be the mistress of the game animals. And it certainly looks as if the cave paintings of Europe, of Ice Age Europe, those great bison and horse and other animals, including mastodons and stuff, those are images of the immortal game animals, the immortal aspect, the spirits, the guardian spirits of the animals. They're not just prosaic, ordinary animals. They're sort of magical ones. So, okay, in that sense, you can say hunter-gatherers have religion. I don't quite like the word religion because it smacks of the idea of God. Well, they certainly have magic. and they certainly have magic in their lives, and they have these magical beliefs in all kinds of potencies. As soon as you examine those things, you realize actually that that's in no sense irrational. Those beliefs make a damn lot of really materialistic sense. It makes a lot of sense to not abuse or laugh at the spirits of the animals. It makes, because once you start laughing at the blood of game animals and sort of feeling triumphalist about it, who knows where, given that humans evolved with, we talk about man the tool maker, let's not forget those tools weren't just like sort of hammers and saws and planes and bradawls. They were weapons of mass destruction. So unless there's a lot of social control over the shedding of blood, including the shedding of animal blood, you're in trouble. You know, if men can just like shed blood and make a profit out of it, make a personal gain out of it, you don't know where it's going to end up. I mean, and we can get a good idea of where it might end up, because even chimpanzees don't actually use weapons, but they can do a lot of damage to each other without using artificial weapons. Chimpanzees are notorious for, if they invade a neighboring territory, finding some female or male, and a whole bunch of chimps will stamp on them until they're a layer of sort of centimeter thick flesh and bone and blood and muscle on the ground. I mean, they'll really do a lot of damage. So, okay, so now what Graeber says is that these spirits, forest spirits, if you want to call them that, they're like kings. It's like, and he actually says hunter-gatherers have kings. And he said, what do you mean by kings? He said, well, you know, a king, just think of a king, you know, medieval king, or I don't know, some king. What is he? He's a combination of a mortal being with a god. So kings seem to have begun as divine kings. Any kind of kingship, it seems, is associated with the idea of divinity, of magical potency. Many of those early kings, of course, thought they could control the weather, or it was believed that they could control the weather, or control thunderstorms, or all sorts of magical powers associated with kingship and sovereignty. So what David Graeber says, getting this idea, by the way, from his mentor, Marshall Sahlins, but he completely supported it and made it his own, is the idea that hunter-gatherers have kings in the form of these gods, but never let the god, if you like, come down from the sky and inhabit a mortal body. So they have kings, but they sort of keep them up in the air somewhere. But still, despite that, as I'm sure you read this from the book, despite that, it's no good saying they're not real. Everyone believes in these kings, these gods, and therefore they have the power of life and death over humans, and therefore they can be terrifying and are terrifying, and therefore humans, including hunters and gatherers, are cowering in fear of the king, of the state, in the form of these divine beings. So, I mean, what do we make of all that? I mean, the problem here is that David obviously hasn't read and it is absolutely astonishing, the kind of taboo on hunter-gatherer research. He hasn't read the first thing about these divinities of egalitarian hunters and gatherers. Now, most people probably, even if they haven't read a lot, have heard of the figure of the trickster. And the trickster is the version of divinity which hunter-gatherers have. And the trickster is a god who is an idiot, who you laugh at, who is the creator of the world, but he's also completely messes everything up. And the thing about the trickster is that he moves between life and death, male and female, animal and human, creativity and absurd mischief. And he's a laugh. Now, hunters and gatherers laugh at their gods. They laugh at them. They're egalitarians. They don't stand on ceremony. They don't accept anyone's sort of authority over them. And if hunter-gatherers are laughing at Jerome Lewis, my colleague at the UCL here, he says he's kind of an initiated member of the Benjeli community. He says we party with our gods. You know, we laugh with them, play with them, party with them. The idea that they're a king is absolutely foolish. It's just ridiculous. And so I don't know. It's an astonishing thing. And of course, even apart from that, to kind of suggest that hunter-gatherers can't be egalitarian because they have religion, and religion is the state. And that's the argument, by the way. The idea is that any form of religion equals the state, equals state coercion. And because all humans have a religion of one form or another, which is kind of true. All humans have shared beliefs about things, which, I mean, under capitalism, we have we're a weird religion. I mean, we all believe in this total hallucination. It's called money, and we all think money is real. Well, the money isn't real. As soon as it depends, it depends on belief, just like any other thing anything which humans consider important and worth fighting over, a flag or something, its value will be dependent on belief. But to argue that hunter-gatherers can't be egalitarian or communist because they have beliefs, shared beliefs, they have religion, I don't know. It is astonishing. It is really astonishing. And the sort of scale of, I don't know, what do you call it? I wouldn't want to call it ignorance exactly. David Graeber is the last person I want to call ignorant. He's incredibly, wonderfully, excitingly erudite. There's just a huge blockage around hunters and gatherers. And also, I have to say, around the whole topic of evolution. He won't discuss human evolution origins in Africa. Certainly won't discuss, primate evolution. Never goes anywhere near genetics. Actually, is quite, I won't say hostile to science. That's putting it too strong. But he refuses to invoke science, and I could go into why. And there are quite good reasons not to invoke science. I can see why the idea that science is some kind of authority and you can just, harness it to your prejudices is unpleasant. But he won't use the resources of modern genetics and other forms of scientific knowledge around the evolution of our species. It won't go there at all. And so for him, origins means sort of things we're familiar with, means history. And it all kind of starts in Europe with the Upper Paleolithic, and any kind of evolutionary framework is kind of anathema, actually. I mean, it's real hostility on the part of David and his colleagues, real hostility to Darwinism, for example. I mean, he recommends that we just forget Darwin and go instead to Kropotkin, which is nice. I like the idea of mutual aid, but the idea that nature is all about mutual aid. I mean, in an age of coronavirus, that little virus is not trying to help us. I can tell you that now. It's trying to replicate itself.
I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it was trying to take out Boris Johnson. So I remember seeing a documentary on the BBC a few years ago. It was kind of an anthropological one. I think it was from the 70s, about, you might know of it, called about the Baku people. I think in Cameroon. They were like a forest dwelling. They actually did a 20-year or 30-year catch-up, which was extraordinarily depressing. It was the most depressing thing I've ever seen in my life. But they seemed to be living the kind of, I don't know if they were hunter-gatherers or slightly agricultural, but living in the forest. But they had I remember they had this ritual where the men would go out of the camp and they had face masks, kind of like big scary faces, and they would come back into the children and they would perform some kind of ritual, frightening the kids, Everybody in the place, all the adults, I'd say all kids over by the age of 8, knew who the guys were with the masks on, right? And there was no sense in which these gods or whatever, they were coming down, the spirits, to frighten them or whatever. There was no sense in really which any adult was afraid in any sense. It seemed much more like pantomime or a way to teach kids a certain moral. I don't know if I have the analysis correct or whatever, but it would seem very far away to me from the fact that the adults were terrified that this was a state or someone who could tell them what to do. It seemed much more like pantomime.
Yes, well, the Bengeli is very similar. They have a word masana, and masana means play, and they have no separate word for religion. So children play, and it's called masana, and the children's play is very much like the boys play, the girls play, and it's kind of the boys fight the girls fight the boys, and there's a kind of teasing, sort of playful animosity between the two gender camps. But there's no word for religion or ritual, which isn't considered to be an adult version of children's play. But of course, it's also true, isn't it, that when kids are playing a game in the playground, there's something serious about it. It's something sacred about the game. You get very upset with the spoil sport that comes in and messes it all up. So while you're in the game, while you are playing, you have to sort of suspend disbelief. You have to sort of take for real the things that you're doing in what you've just called, quite correctly, in my view, a pantomime. So and it's just the same with the Bengeli. There'll be Ngoku, the women's ritual, and Ngoku is the spirit of the women, and then there's a Jengi, and that's the spirit of the men. And the Jengi takes the form, a kind of a costume really of with raffia, and it's you dance and shake with it, and it's a symbol of male fertility. But and of course it is true as well that with hunter gatherers, where as young girls come of age, they go through a kind of initiation. In other words, first menstruation is quite significant, and the blood is considered magical, and the girl is blessed by the moon when she starts to bleed. And also boys go through a kind of initiation. In their case, it rests on hunting and shedding blood in a different way from the way women shed blood as menstrual blood. But there's a link between the two kinds of blood. So although there's initiation is kind of a form of coercive instruction, you could conceive it negatively in that way. The real important point to make is that it's not top down. It's actually bottom up. There's a real reason why women need to make sure that men respect them, that sex isn't a free-for-all, that there are rules around anything to do with sex. And so as boys and girls get into sex, they need to be made aware. And there might be a little bit, when the kids are small, when they're young, an element of sort of fear, a small element of fear, and exactly like you're saying, when as you grow up, you realize the whole thing's a kind of game. But a certain amount of sort of respect for this bottom-up upheaval, this collectivist upheaval, to make everyone aware. I'll put it in a nutshell, really. The principle of this kind of religion, hunter-gatherer religion, is very simple to express. Some things are sacred, and the body above all. And particularly for women, if the body is not sacred, if you can't say no and mean it, if no doesn't mean no when you need it to mean no, if the body is not sacred, nothing is sacred. And if nothing is sacred, that is a terrible situation for any community, because you're going to be back into something like, non-human primate. I mean, non-human primates, they cooperate, but there's a lot of competition as well. And there's no group level morality. If somebody's beating you up, you can't go to any kind of higher court. There's no recourse really. And the idea of justice and morality and so on, I mean, that's just not part of Darwinism. And we had to kind of get out of a Darwinian logic of social action into a distinctively human form with this fundamental principle that some things are sacred, and that is I mean, where do we find that principle? I mean, the way we look at it in radical anthropology group, our network, is a familiar concept, isn't it? Every time you go on a picket line, you say, "Do not cross a picket line." Some things are sacred. You don't recommend that people say, "Oh well, it's only a rather small picket line," or "I think these people are rather weak. I could probably beat them up." You don't cross a picket line. It's a fundamental sacred rule of the labor movement, and what I'm saying there is it's that rule, never cross a picket line. It's not top down. It's not imposed by trade union barons in the way maybe the right wing press would suggest. Anyone in a workplace, they don't have to be particularly political. They don't even have to be socialists. Of course, they can be. And on a picket line, you don't want them to have to be socialists. You want everyone to join the picket line, irrespective of ethnicity, religion, race, class, whatever it is. Just join the picket line, and people do, and people get it. And the basic principle there is you don't cheat on your brothers and sisters. You don't gain the benefit of strike action while not paying the costs. So that's a very good illustration. The picket line is a very good illustration of the kind of, if you like, religion or taboo that we should be familiar with in the labour movement. And of course, as I said earlier, David was magnificent on the picket line. I mean, we've had a lot of, in the last 4 or 5 years, because there have been so many strikes at universities, a lot of our lectures, including mine and David's, have been on the picket line. For example, at University College London, where I work. So I'm just saying a taboo or a religious principle, the word religion doesn't appropriate to a picket line, but the idea that some things are sacred, don't cross a picket line, that can be bottom up. It does not have to be top down.
Just getting back to you mentioned earlier about the trickster god, it kind of strikes me that, like, just thinking of like Norse mythology, you had Loki, who seemed quite a kind of joker, kind of a god. Do we see that kind of trickster god in religions kind of outside of hunter-gatherer ones? Do we see remnants of the trickster god, say, in early agricultural societies before they become monotheistic and all that?
There's no question. We certainly do. And an interesting take on all that is Matthias Günther, one of the best researchers, anthropologists on hunter-gatherer religion. he describes beautifully how when the missionaries arrived with the Southern African hunter-gatherers, the Bushman people, and with their story about Jesus, the hunter-gatherers said, "Oh, yeah, we know that fella. Yeah, doesn't he die and come alive again? Doesn't he perform miracles? Yeah, oh, he's one of us. He's definitely a trickster. That Jesus, he ain't enough clever, that one."
That's good. So, getting back to Graeber's research, why is it then, do you think, that his, well, I don't know whether you want to call them a school or whatever, but like that circle of anthropologists he ran in, why would they exclude the research on hunter-gatherers? That would seem to me like to be some of the most fundamentally important anthropological work you could do, would be to look at stuff in that as close to prehistory as you could.
Well, you're echoing my feelings and thoughts, of course. When I first heard David talk about communism, it was during the occupied London period when we were occupying my college. And of course, it was roughly the same time as the Arab Spring. And I just remember David with a huge attendance in one of the occupations at the University of London Union in a very big hall. And I just thought it was so brilliant because he chose to talk about communism. And he explained in such an eloquent way, with so much interchange and laughter from all of us, how communism is just the way we live. If we get a chance, everyone needs to laugh. You can't laugh with your boss. You can't laugh with your subordinate. Laughter is a necessary medicine, and we always gravitate towards people we can laugh with, and they will be our equals. We always seek out for a drink or whatever, a party, people we're on the same level as. And then, of course, within that community, we will follow this principle, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. Somebody's not well, we'll stand in for them. Somebody needs their shopping done or whatever it is, we'll do it. It just makes you feel good to feel part of a community. But he called this communism. And I thought, who else talks about communism these days? I mean, we've got various funny little socialist sects, mostly pretty damn useless in my view, but I don't know, Socialist Workers' Party. Do they ever talk about communism? They might in secret, in a small little group somewhere, but they won't come out in the open and celebrate the idea of communism. David was doing that, and I just thought, this is marvelous, this is brilliant. It was only a little bit later that I began to realize this is a very cuddly, this is a very, I don't know, easy to accept version of communism, because he says communism has got nothing to do with property relationships, because to each according to their ability, to each according to their need, is a mode of relationship with others. And of course, as long as you're getting on with people, you're a nice person, you're friendly, and so on, you're a communist. Well, when he brought his book out, Debt, it was widely rumored, and I think accurately. I mean, actually, David himself told me this. He said, "Chris, all kinds of senior bankers are reading my book." Oh, that's nice, that's good. Well, just think about it. I mean, a kind of communism which doesn't need any bankers to let go of their property, but all you've got to do is be a nice person, getting on with people, being convivial, and on an interpersonal relationship level. That kind of communism is going to be kind of more acceptable, isn't it? More widely acceptable, more likely to get picked up by the media. Oh, this is a nice form of communism. It's friendly. It's not brutal. It's not bitter. It's not divisive. It doesn't separate. You can be a banker. You can be a corporate mogul and still be a communist, because it's got nothing to do with property. So that's no doubt at all, in my mind, one of the reasons why. I'm not saying one of the reasons why David adopted that position, but it's one of the reasons why a particular version of communism, which is independent of property relationships, might be more acceptable within the mainstream and more acceptable within the media than, say, my version of communism. My version of communism is, of course, it means common ownership, and it means that people who've got a lot of property need to be deprived of that monopoly of their property without some kind of I'm not in favour of violence. I'm in favour of doing it by persuasion, but probably you'll need a bit of coercion, hopefully legitimate coercion, because you might have, you might have popular support and even, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, so that's one reason, the fact that it's a very cuddly version of communism. If you look at his, and I've only recently done this, his most important book in many ways, Lost People, Magic and the Legacy of Slavery in Madagascar. So I'm now, if you let me, if I've got time. So now what happens with anthropologists is that you do your field work. And your field work is like an initiation ritual. It decisively shapes all your thinking from that point on. My colleague, Jerome Lewis, did this intensive fieldwork with his whole family, actually, in the first few years among these, if you like, communistic, egalitarian hunter-gatherers called the Benjeli. And every anthropologist, you'll just find that wherever they've done their fieldwork, because you can only do it once, you only live once, and you've got to learn the language, and I don't know, you probably need to do it before you've got a family, and so many. Although actually Jerome had his family while in the forest, and his kids were there as well. So where did David Graeber do his fieldwork in the late 80s, early 90s? He did it in Madagascar. Why did he call his book, which eventually got published in 2007, Lost People? And what does lost people mean? All that. So it turns out as follows, that in the part of central Madagascar, a little village really, or kind of quite a large village actually, called Petafo, where he did his fieldwork, and this applies to most of Madagascar, there's a huge division between the indigenous people, and Madagascar was only populated by humans from about AD 800 or something. It's extraordinary. People never got from Africa eastward to Madagascar. It was a paradise for the lemurs and other extraordinary creatures. No humans arrived. But then humans did arrive. And where did they come from? Borneo, southern Borneo. And they arrived on Madagascar with the music, the language, which they still got, of course, and a particular religion, which centered around ancestor worship and building of very spectacular tombs. And what happens is that you, once a year or so, every now and again, your family need to put on at very great expense a ritual of reopening the tomb. You go into the tomb, you find your mum, your dad, whoever, with their bodies now dried. You pick up their dried body and you shake it around, and it all turns to dust. You smash the bones around, all the bits of clothing and dried up flesh, and you do this partly to sort of recognize your dead ancestors, but partly also to kind of anonymize them, because the dust of all the ancestors all gets mixed up there. And what you don't want is an ancestor who's got a grudge against you wandering around causing mischief. So that's the ritual. But as I say, it's a very costly ritual. Now, Madagascar is divided into people who are Andriana, that means nobles, that means these are indigenous people who came originally from Borneo. And the other category is what are called the blacks, or the Menti. And these are descendants of slaves. So you have either descendants of African slaves, or you have descendants of people from Borneo. And the Borneo people who practice this ancestor worship all consider themselves nobles in one way or another, because they're indigenous. They've always been there. They've got long histories of descent. Whereas the blacks, of course, far from having a long history, they've all been uprooted from their culture, from wherever in Africa they were captured and brought across. And with extreme brutality, a young girl would be separated from her mother and put far away, and people were separated from their kin, from their family, from their language, from their culture, and then sold. And you'd get sold as a slave, you get sold to a household anywhere really in the island, massively dispersed. Now, those are the lost people. The descendants of slaves are lost people in the sense they've been uprooted. And the nobles are lost because they've become lost in the last few decades, perhaps during the 20th century in particular. Now, slavery was only abolished by the French in 1895. And now the whole topic of slavery is something which the nobles, the indigenous people, to put it mildly, they're reticent about. There's a kind of feeling of guilt about having been, slaveholders. But more than that, the nobles, coming from a position where they're pretty much used to do any work, it's largely about rice growing, and the rice growing is in the valleys, in the moist valleys, where you can have enough water. And the nobles would always live on the high ground and keep on the high ground. They didn't want to get their shoes muddy, and because that's the job of the slaves. So they don't like doing, even to this day, they don't like doing too much of this physical hard work. So what happened was that when money began to become important in Madagascar, initially there was quite a lot of banditry in it, and the bandits tended to be from slave ancestry. So there's banditry. And then, in addition to that, various kinds of trading in cash, which again was sort of beneath the aristocrats. They were landowners, rather like, I suppose, aristocracies elsewhere. And you wouldn't demean yourselves with with petty trading. So what it meant was that over time, over 40, 50, 60 years, increasingly, the weight of economic significance, the descendants of slaves, the people, they're called blacks, whatever the color they are exactly, and the others are called, they're kind of called whites, even though they're not exactly white. They come from Borneo. Anyway, that's the sort of the stereotypic labels are given. So what happened was that now there's a particular. I'll just give it through an example. A particular noble called Seli. He needed to put on one of these famidhanas, one of these tomb opening rituals, which is actually very expensive. So he needed to borrow some money. And guess what? It was an astrologer from a slave background who'd already accumulated quite a lot of money from doing astrology. Astrology means every time something goes wrong, you just charge for you did whatever it is you did it the wrong phase of the moon, you did it the wrong way or whatever. And so he was quite wealthy, and he was able to lend money to this aristocrat. And he lent it with collateral, and the collateral was like 10 times the value of the initial borrowing. So this person, this aristocrat, but then he couldn't pay it back. So of course he increasingly had to surrender his property. And so increasingly what's happened over the last 50 or more years, probably more like a century, is that the world has turned upside down. The nobles are lost people because they are now having to do wage work for their former slaves or the families of their former slaves. And their former slaves are economically in the ascendancy because they're used to work and happy to do the work. And although originally they might have been dwelling in the bottom of a valley, so when they died, they'd just be shoved with any old person, increasingly they're now in a position to challenge the aristocrats with their rituals. Now, why am I saying all this? Because, according to Graeber, everything's turned upside down in terms of Marxism, that the mode of subsistence, the mode of production, constrain the relations of production. All right, where does it all end up? On Madagascar, the arrow of causality assumed by historical materialists, by a Marxist, the arrow of causality from the idea that the mode of subsistence governs or constrains the relationships of production, and that in turn shapes the ideology, that on Madagascar is now turned upside down because the narrative decides the property. And so what it is that if you're a noble and you can come up with a convincing narrative about your nobility, about your ancestors, that will generate public confidence, and you won't have to default on whatever loans you've taken out because there will be confidence that you can repay the loans. But supposing you make a mistake, supposing you mix the wrong ancestors in some ceremony, which seems to show that you don't know who your ancestors were, or suppose you, in your story about your ancestry, you say something which is then challenged by somebody else, then you lose confidence. Your story doesn't add up. People lose confidence not just in your story but in who you are, and then that has an effect on confidence, including confidence in your financial viability. So what happens is that everybody's fighting to produce a convincing narrative about their ancestry, and if you can get away with a convincing narrative by saying, for example, that you married into this family or that family, or this person wasn't a bastard, this person was legitimate, and all those things, that in turn has an effect on your property relationships. Now, I get from David Graeber that he's taken that idea and carried it all over the place. That, in other words, that the narrative you tell is your choice, really, and your choice to tell a narrative then has an effect on your success in life, including your property relationships. And then linked to that is David's kind of egalitarian attitude to his fieldwork. He didn't want to come into Madagascar and become a guest of the people he was living with in this village and do science, because he said, look, science means you're acting like a colonial administrator. You're just ticking boxes. You're looking for statistics, for regularities, levels of wealth in this population, that population, or whatever it is. He says, no, you're meeting real people. and you want to listen to their stories. And each person's an individual, and they've got their personal story. And then David says, and I've got my personal story, and I will exchange my story with their story. And each person's utterly, utterly, utterly different from everyone. There's no such thing as a culture. There's no such thing as a stable cultural system. There's no such thing as a sort of a set of moral rules. Everyone's breaking the rules all the time, especially because in Madagascar, since the French left, the state apparatus has become completely moribund. Everyone just works things out themselves, and they may fill in the odd form or something when they purchase some property or somebody, but nobody's going to come down on them, but from the central government unless there's been a very serious murder, the police will just let sleeping dogs lie. There's nothing going on there. So from that, David seems to me have learned a kind of, I won't say hostility to science, but he thinks of science as a kind of colonial endeavor. Let's not do science. Let's just talk to people, and let's listen to their stories, and let's recognize that everybody's got a choice. Anybody can have this choice of story, that choice of story, and because everyone's starting off from the point of view of being a sort of, he uses this term, lost people. Everyone's a kind of lost person who can make their own identity. Now, if you apply that to history as a whole, you end up with the idea there are no stages of historical evolution. You can't say there was a stage of primitive communism followed by a stage of whatever else it was, feudalism, say, or capitalism. There's no directionality of history. Wherever you are, including in a city or in a farm, you've got choices. And so it's a kind of an idea of freedom. And he says you're just as likely to have communism if you're a farmer or a city dweller as if you're hunting and gathering. So, I mean, these ideas are lovely. They're interesting. It gives you a feeling, well, okay, I can be what I like. But I don't know. They're just, it's just astonishingly divorced from reality. I mean, the idea that a farmer is going to be, you're a farmer, and you're going to be just as likely to let everyone come onto your land and share the land as if you're a hunter and gatherer is just, to say it's wrong is an understatement. Farming means fences. You need to, grow the crops, and you need to make sure that somebody else doesn't come in at the harvest time and steal everything. And the same with cattle ownership. You're not going to be, you're going to be quite protective about your herd. You're going to brand your cattle. But he just ignores all of that stuff and says that every stage of society, people have got choices. And I can sort of see another, in a way, good political argument here. He says, if you say that only hunter-gatherers had communism, remembering that hunter-gatherers are very small communities, 50 at most, maybe 20 or so in a camp, he says that means you're basically saying that living in a city, London, New York, wherever, Paris, you can't have communism because these are large-scale societies. And he says, actually, there's plenty of evidence that the earliest cities were just as egalitarian or communist as these allegedly simple utopian hunter-gatherer bands. So he wants to sort of say, irrespective of the mode of production, irrespective of the property relationships, you can have communism. But even then, of course, he tempers that by saying, well, you can have an element of communism because you're never going to get communism. You're never going to get a society governed by just one principle. It's always going to be a mix of communism and other things, including the state. And that is what he finds in Madagascar. There is a state, but people are constantly disputing the state, and they're constantly finding enclaves of much more cooperative, sort of egalitarian relationships in and against the state. The state isn't that relevant. You can, and Graeber's politics is the same. He says, don't think of overthrowing the state. Don't think of overthrowing capitalism. Find liberated zones, enclaves.
Yeah, it's a very strange idea to me. I met him once in around Occupy, and when I was probably starting the podcast, and I think I'd just read the Debt book. I had been in Madagascar actually for about a month.
Oh,
actually,
right.
when there was a revolution in Madagascar, or a coup in Madagascar, actually I arrived there on a plane, and they searched the plane for mercenaries. When I was getting off the plane, the army were there checking us all out. I was probably too weedy to look like a mercenary. But I was in the country for about a month after there was a coup after happening, and I think it was about 2008, maybe 2009. But this idea that these kind of liberated spaces in Madagascar you could put forward as, say, a good thing for anarchism or communism. It just struck me as absolutely crazy. Like, of all the countries, I've been to quite a good few countries in my time, and of all the countries I've been to, perhaps maybe bar Venezuela. Venezuela was a very messed up place when I was there. And Madagascar was unbelievable. Like, half the country was on fire when I was there. Literally, there were burning forests everywhere. The roads the roads between major cities would sometimes look like they hadn't been done in 20 years. Like, literally, you couldn't drive on the road. It was easier to drive on the side of the road than on the road. There was a complete breakdown of any kind of society. It was definitely the poorest place I'd been to in Africa. You know, I just struck me as like a kind of mind bending that he would put forward, like what seemed to me was like a collapse of society as a, as a paragon for anarchism or something.
To be fair, he doesn't say it's a paragon. He's perfectly well aware, and he says this, that if this is anarchism, it's a pretty dilapidated, sorry form of anarchism, and it's certainly not egalitarian. There's huge status rivalries. When he went, the village he lived in, every family sort of was in conflict with every other family, and there was very little sense of real, any kind of community stretching across the landscape. So he's not idealizing it really, but he's kind of saying, here as anywhere else, you will find wonderful people, wonderful friendship, but you'll also find liars, cheats, vagabonds, murderers. You'll find all human life is there. But he sort of says, well, that's life. That's where everything is. And of course, I'm just thinking about that and listening to what you've just said. I mean, what about the United States? I mean, lost people, I don't know, all these strange characters that end up voting for somebody called Donald Trump. I mean, uprooted, out of work, all their traditions sort of, I don't know, no longer meaning a lot. And then turning up, the other day on Capitol Hill with all their funny little banners and slogans, some of them Confederate and others, whatever they are, dressed up as cavemen and wolves and Neanderthals and stuff, all looking for a story. I mean, it's sort of, lost people is not a bad, lost people captures something going on in the world at the moment, doesn't it?
When I was talking to him, I kind of got the impression he was saying like how positive the way that people in Madagascar kind of came together to do stuff when the state collapsed. Yeah. That they did it on their own back. They would like self-organize, and that he was very positive about that. Yeah, and I do find this idea of communism in the cracks and all that, I find it a very amenable theory to capital. Let's put it that way. Yeah. Like, it seems quite reasonable to me that like somebody like Graeber with that kind of politics will be the type of person who would turn up on Newsnight or whatever and not say like yourself, Chris.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they don't want me. There's no question about that because, obviously I come from a completely different revolutionary Marxist Bolshevik tradition. I've learned a lot about, by the way, I have to say, I've learned a lot from all sorts of sources, including most of all Reclaim the Streets, about the value of play and amusement and laughter. And I learned from Reclaim the Streets that really, if you're not having fun I don't, fun's too trivial a word, but if you're not sort of showing in what you're doing that it is an enjoyable, fulfilling way of life, so that in action you're sort of prefiguring the future, as opposed to sort of saying, well, yeah, we're all going to be nice people, but not until we got socialism. I learned from Reclaim the Streets the importance of of conviviality, getting a bit drunk now and again, and having a good time, because otherwise you're not proving that your way of life is actually worth living. It's going to be probably worse than what we started with, or could well be. That's an aspect of Graeber's politics which I share. But but that doesn't mean you give up on the project of revolution, which of course is more needed than ever before. Because to be honest, there won't be any life on Earth if we let capitalism just burn all the forests and destroy us. But B, I do actually think that the tide is turning. I think these fascists in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in America, I mean Boris Johnson over here, they've had their go for whatever it is, 20 years, 15 years or so, been a very unpleasant, scary right-wing tide. I think that's losing its shine. And now we've got to go hell for leather for a global revolution based on science. In some ways, the most, damaging feature of Graeber's politics is the way in which he just thinks that storytelling is enough, that science isn't relevant. Well, I mean, I would just argue the opposite. I would say, and by that I just mean what everybody means by science. I just mean this collectivist, accountable, internationalist pursuit of knowledge, which is, everybody's pulled down. You have a theory, somebody else pulls it down. It's a difficult thing to survive with your theories, including my theory, of course. But there is such a thing as science. It's been far too corporatized. It's been far too fragmented. It's been far too removed from the issues which really matter, like what does it mean to be human. But to me, the politics which isn't rooted in science, for me, the scientific community worldwide needs to find its voice, including its political voice. Kind of might be doing that now. Medical science, COVID, scientists are beginning to say to the politicians, "You're idiots. You've got blood in your hands." And the same with climate scientists. They're beginning to say, "You need to do a few things if we want a livable planet for our kids. We need to actually coercively legislate against, criminality to forests and seas and stuff." So for me, the voice of science needs to be heard. Science needs to be absolutely autonomous. No way should science be subordinate to politics of any kind. But the scientific community needs to develop its own politics, its own political voice.
Just to kind of wrap up, I suppose, one thing I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about was what confused me from talking about Graeber's work was he seemed to always, very regularly align himself in media when I would see him with kind of post-Keynesian economists. So Steve Keen, Dr. Michael Hudson, these types who were maybe some kind of Marx-inspired, but moreover were linked to a state form of money and to kind of Keynesian or post-Keynesian economics. That always struck me as a very, very strange combination between being an anarchist and being very linked up to this kind of a Keynesian idea of a demand-managed capitalism. When you talk about his ideas, it does seem to kind of cohere this idea that the state is always there, so therefore we should just be left statist, even as an anarchist.
I don't quite know how to respond there. The basic point is that he doesn't think that expropriating the capitalists is part of the program. He seems to think that property relationships aren't the main thing. I mean, a very positive part of debt is his emphasis on violence. I think that's quite good. And although that's classic Marxism, because Engels described the state as armed bodies of men, a view which was, of course, taken up by Lenin and Trotsky, the state as armed bodies of men. You don't have a revolution unless you can find some way of provoking a mutiny or some way disarming the violence of the state. So Graeber has the idea that violence is crucial, and especially crucial to money. So he makes a very important point, which is that dependence on money, on fiat money, on money where the coin or paper banknote is just worth immeasurably more than the material intrinsic value of the paper or the metal, that depends on violence. So outside the warlord or whoever this king or whoever it is, his remit stretches beyond the boundaries of his empire or kingdom. This money has got no value. And he makes the point that today, what's happened is that the entire planet has become subject to this violence. Maybe mostly British imperialism, American imperialism, the Chinese, of course, weighing in now. And his point is really that should this capacity to impose robbery and exploitation on the planet begin to waver, should American imperialism and maybe the other imperialisms sort of start to be ineffective in pillaging and rendering us all dependent on their hallucinations called money, then the whole system will begin to collapse. So, I mean, that's an interesting point, and maybe a point not sufficiently stressed by Marxists, this question of violence. And of course, what it then sort of leads to is the idea that if you can begin to resist the violence of the state, if you can begin to form liberated zones, you can begin to occupy, Wall Street or other places, and then somehow prevent the state from wading in with its violence in whatever way, that in itself will kind of dissolve the monetary relationships and the property relationships, I can see a kind of logic to that. But of course, you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, if you take debt, his solution to our problems, obviously you have to sort of scramble around, and like anybody else, he's asked, okay, David, what do we do? And he says, well, cancel the debt. And of course, I mean, you're asking a state to cancel all its debts. You're asking American imperialism, Chinese cancel their debts. I mean, it's a feeble answer, an inadequate answer. David, to be fair to him, he says that of course it's an inadequate answer. It's just I had to come up with something. So cancel the debt was a bit of a catchphrase at that time, wasn't it? It was all around the place. All these bishops demanding that bankers cancel the debts. I mean, I'm not against cancelling the debts. I'm in favour of defaulting on the debts as well, of course. And I'm not saying David was against that, but you're right. But for me, the crucial thing is his loss of confidence. I mean, I don't understand it as well. He seems to think that all these exciting developments all started in Seattle in November the 30th, 1999, wasn't it? And I just think, David, were you just inactive before then? Didn't you realise all the build-up to Seattle? I mean, all the different events which happened with the Zapatistas, with the Dockers dispute, which went global, that I was part of, and so many other things, that we were in a massive process in the 90s, a massive worldwide movement, building and building and building, which it kind of reached a kind of climax with Seattle and some other major movements. I'm thinking of Bologna and Prague and others, of course. But I don't know. He seems to have got disappointed by Seattle. That for him, Seattle should have been the revolution, I think. And when it didn't happen, and he's written about this, he seems to think, okay, Seattle didn't work. We didn't have the revolution. More or less telling people like me, Chris, that was your revolution. It didn't work. Let's now try for something more modest. And that's where I'm not sure I want to go down that road. I mean, Seattle wasn't too ambitious. It wasn't. I mean, it was an extraordinary event, and for me, absolutely. I happen to know that we did Seattle 2 years earlier, but because Seattle is a port, and of course the Liverpool Dockers and their supporters in Seattle. We linked the environmentalists with the trade unionists in Seattle before the famous Seattle. We had a whole 2 weeks in January. What was it? January 1997, I believe. Yes, we didn't win the revolution. That was a huge sort of upheaval. It sort of reached the climax and then went backwards because I won't go into it, but for whatever reason, we didn't quite manage to seize the moment. And Al-Qaeda seized the moment instead with their Twin Towers attack. And then things went downhill, of course, after that. I just think that Graeber came into things rather late in life. He seems to have written very little about politics. He wrote about Buffy the Vampire Slayer and various other interesting topics before writing about Seattle. And I'm quite keen on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It's a great, but he came in rather late to it all. Maybe got overexcited, then got a bit disappointed, and then for the rest of his life, tragically short as it was, and I want to say overwhelmingly, whatever criticisms I've got, I mean, David's impact on anthropology has been nothing but positive. I mean, he put anthropology on the map. Everyone's interested now. He's just released all those treasures from the rich record of all kinds of fieldwork of what it means to be human, all the different ways there are of being human, other than the narrow, turbo capitalist path we're all being pushed down. But I think that he got disappointed and decided that being modest, as he puts it, was kind of the way to go, and ended up being very popular, but not so revolutionary.
On this episode, you heard the theme tune The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters and Night of the Purple Moon by Sun Ra and his orchestra. Thank you for listening, and please join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega. This show is a member of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast and research collective. Make sure to check out our network sister podcasts, General Intellect Unit, Jumpsuit Utopia, Mortal Science, and Swampside Chats.